scientists say they have confirmed theories that the remains of the 15th century explorer Christopher Columbus were in Seville Cathedral in Spain, and say a 22-year investigation, including DNA analysis.
What if the most famous explorer in history wasn't who they said he was? For over 500 years, the story of Christopher Columbus stayed locked in place. Italian sailor, Catholic hero, accidental discoverer of the New World. Schools taught it. Nations celebrated it. No one questioned it. But his private letters contained symbols that didn't belong. His voyage left on a date that wasn't a coincidence. His money came from people wearing masks just like his. And when scientists finally tested the bones, everything fell apart. This isn't about correcting history. This is about exposing a lie so big that it took DNA evidence to crack it open. The truth was always there. They just made sure no one looked. The name everyone got wrong. For 532 years, the story started the same way. A Genoese sailor, a Catholic explorer, a man from northern Italy who convinced the Spanish crown to fund a westward voyage and, in doing so, accidentally reshaped the entire world. That story was taught in every school, stamped on every textbook, and carved into courthouse statues across 2 continents. It was so settled that questioning it felt almost pointless. Then, in October 2024, a forensic scientist stepped in front of cameras at the Royal National Academy of Medicine of Spain in Madrid and said the quiet part out loud. After 21 years of DNA research, the results were clear. Christopher Columbus was not Italian. He was, in all probability, a Sephardic Jew from the Western Mediterranean. The announcement aired on Spain's national public broadcaster TVE on October 12th, the day of Spain's national holiday marking the arrival of Columbus's expedition in the Americas. The timing was not accidental. The documentary was called ADN, Su Verdadero Origen, Columbus DNA, His True Origin. And what it revealed had been building underground for over 2 decades. The 22-year investigation nobody noticed. The research did not begin with a press conference. It began with a bone fragment and a question nobody could officially answer. Whose remains were actually sitting inside the tomb at Seville Cathedral? The team behind the research was led by forensic scientist José Antonio Lorente from the University of Granada, who spent more than 20 years working on this case. Lorente's team worked with laboratories in Spain, the United States, Mexico, and Italy, all of which independently confirmed the DNA matches without communication between the clinics. That last detail matters. This was not one lab chasing a headline. 4 independent teams on 2 continents, working blind to each other, arrived at the same result. Studies of Columbus's DNA started in 2003, the year his remains were exhumed from the catacombs of Seville's cathedral by Granada University forensic medicine professor José Antonio Lorente. Before his team was able to begin, they cross-examined the remains with DNA from some of Columbus's known relatives, including his son Fernando Colón, to make sure they did indeed belong to the explorer. That verification step alone took years. The sample sizes were extraordinarily small. Only 15% of the bone mass remained when researchers opened the Seville tomb. Working with fragments that had spent 5 centuries inside a cathedral in varying conditions of humidity, they were extracting usable genetic information from material that should, by most standards, have been unreadable. We have DNA from Christopher Columbus, very partial but sufficient. We have DNA from Hernando Colón, his son, Lorente said, and both in the Y chromosome and in the mitochondrial DNA of Hernando, there are traits compatible with Jewish origin. The results did 2 things at once. They confirmed where Columbus was buried, and they shattered where he was from. The bones that crossed an ocean. 4 times. Before the DNA could mean anything, researchers first had to establish that the bones in Seville were Columbus's at all. That problem alone had been a geopolitical argument for more than a century. Columbus's posthumous journey started when he died in Valladolid, Spain, but his remains were first transferred to the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in 1542, according to his wishes. From there, they were moved to Cuba in 1795, when Spain lost control of Hispaniola, and later returned to Seville in 1898, following Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War. 5 cities, 4 ocean crossings, nearly 4 centuries of movement, mislabeling, and incomplete records. Each transfer created new room for error, and the error arrived in 1877. A worker at the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Menor in Santo Domingo had discovered a box of bones marked "The Illustrious and Excellent Man, Don Colón, Admiral of the Ocean Sea." The Dominican Republic claimed this was the real Columbus, and that when Spain evacuated the island in 1795, they had mistakenly taken the wrong set of remains. The Dominicans have never backed down from that claim. In January 2005, the researchers gained permission to view the purported Columbus remains in Santo Domingo, but Dominican authorities then withdrew permission and refused to allow any attempt to extract DNA from the bones, citing religious objections. They have refused every time since. The Dominican Republic's cardinal has shown no interest in disturbing the conviction of the flocks who crowd the cross-shaped lighthouse mausoleum built on the site where the bones are securely stored. So, science worked with what it had. Using advanced DNA analysis, researchers matched the remains in Seville with those of Columbus's son Hernando and his brother Diego, who are also buried in the cathedral. We can now say with absolute certainty that Christopher Columbus is buried in Seville Cathedral, said forensic scientist Dr. Jose Antonio Lorente. The bones had finally stopped moving, but what the DNA inside them revealed was only just beginning to travel. The Genoa story was always thin. The standard biography of Christopher Columbus begins in 1451 in the Italian port city of Genoa, the son of a wool weaver named Domenico Colombo. It is the version that has been repeated so many times it feels like bedrock, but historians who have looked closely at the primary sources have noticed that bedrock has cracks. Columbus wrote almost exclusively in Spanish and Portuguese, never in Italian or in any Genoese dialect, which would be the expected default of someone raised in the city. His journals, his letters to the Spanish crown, his personal annotations, all of it in the languages of the Iberian Peninsula. Not once did a phrase slip through in the tongue of the city he was supposedly born into. Salvador de Madariaga, in his book Christopher Columbus, being the life of the very magnificent Lord Don Cristobal Colon, observed that Columbus's letters exhibited familiarity with Ladino, the language of Sephardic Jews, and that Columbus signed his documents in an unusual, cryptic fashion mirroring Jewish customs. The DNA results gave those linguistic anomalies a new frame. If there weren't Jews in Genoa in the 15th century, Lorente said, the likelihood that he was from there is minimal. Neither was there a big Jewish presence in the rest of the Italian peninsula, which makes things very tenuous. Lorente's findings lend credibility to a theory championed for years by Francesc Albardaner, the former president of the Center of Columbus Studies in Barcelona. Albardaner's research suggested that Columbus was from a Jewish family of silk weavers in Valencia, and that Columbus concealed his Jewish heritage to avoid the wrath of the Spanish Inquisition, which was mercilessly targeting Jews during that period. A man from a silk-weaving Jewish family in Valencia, writing in the language of the Iberian Peninsula, sailing under the flag of Catholic monarchs who were simultaneously expelling every Jew from their kingdom. That is not the story in the textbooks, but it is the story the bones are telling. The most dangerous year to be alive and Jewish. To understand why Columbus would have buried his identity so completely, you have to understand what Spain looked like in 1492. Not the Spain of exploration and discovery that fills the history books. The other Spain, the one running a systematic purge of its own population at the same time it was funding a voyage to the edge of the known world. The Alhambra Decree was issued on March 31, 1492, by the joint Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, ordering the expulsion of unconverted Jews from the crowns of Castile and Aragon and their territories by July 31st of that year. 4 months. That was the window. Convert to Christianity or leave everything behind. And leaving did not mean walking away cleanly. The Alhambra Decree gave Jews 4 months to leave or become Christian. Jews were not allowed to take money with them, and those who did not leave or who returned were executed. Columbus set sail on August 3, 1492, 3 days after the expulsion deadline. The ships that carried him west departed from the same ports that were simultaneously processing tens of thousands of Jewish refugees being forced out of the country. These were not separate stories happening in parallel. They were the same story, on the same docks, in the same weeks. Columbus's 1492 voyage and the expulsion of the Jews share more than just a temporal proximity. They reflect Spain's dual ambitions of religious unification at home and imperial expansion abroad. The question that the DNA results now force into the open is this: what does it mean that the man leading that westward voyage may have been fleeing the same persecution his sponsors were enforcing? 300,000 people and a countdown. The scale of what was happening in Spain in 1492 does not always land the way it should in modern retellings. These were not abstract religious policies. They were applied to a population that had been woven into Spanish society for centuries. Around 300,000 Jews lived in Spain before the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand ordered Jews and Muslims to convert to the Catholic faith or leave the country. Over half of Spain's Jews had converted as a result of religious persecution and pogroms that occurred in 1391. Due to continuing attacks, around 50,000 more had converted by 1415. By the time the Alhambra Decree arrived, the Jewish community had already been shrinking under pressure for nearly a century. The decree was not the beginning of the persecution. It was the bureaucratic conclusion of it. The main objective of the expulsion of practicing Jews was to ensure the sincerity of the conversions of such a large convert population. Although Judaism was not considered a heresy, professing Christianity while engaging in Jewish practices was heretical. Additionally, limpieza de sangre statutes instituted legal discrimination against converso descendants, barring them from certain positions and forbidding them from emigrating to the Americas. That last line deserves to sit for a moment. Conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, were still legally barred from emigrating to the very territories Columbus was about to open up. The Inquisition did not stop at the waterline. It followed the ships. Devin Narr, Sephardic Studies Program Chair at the University of Washington, explained that escaping persecution in the times of the Catholic monarchs and the Spanish Inquisition was not as easy as simply converting to Catholicism. What the Spanish Inquisition did was that it targeted not Jews as Jews and not Muslims as Muslims, but rather initially and specifically those who were of Jewish or Muslim origin, but who had converted to Catholicism. Conversion was not a clean exit. It was a trapdoor that led to a different kind of scrutiny. A converted Jew was a converso, and a converso was watched. Their neighbors reported them. Their prayer habits were monitored. Their blood was interrogated through the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. which meant that Jewish ancestry could follow a family for generations, regardless of how fervently they practiced Christianity. If Columbus was born into a Sephardic Jewish family, conversion would have been a survival strategy, not a spiritual transformation. And the performance of Catholic devotion, the crosses, the references to God in his journals, the framing of his voyages as divinely ordained, would have been exactly what a man in that position was required to produce. The Converso's Mask. Considering the political and religious persecution Jewish people faced during this time, it is possible that Columbus converted to Catholicism to conceal his Jewish origins. Had he not, he might have never sailed to the Americas. This is the hinge point. Because Columbus did not just need to appear Catholic, he needed to appear Catholic to the specific monarchs who were simultaneously expelling Jews. He was asking Ferdinand and Isabella, the architects of the Alhambra Decree, to fund his expedition. Any whisper of Jewish heritage, any trace of Converso blood that the Inquisition could fix on, would have ended the project before it began. According to historian and Columbus researcher Francesc Albardaner, Columbus would have followed Jewish traditions and customs, although in the public sphere he acted as a Christian. He was born into a family of silk weavers from the Spanish city of Valencia, where there was a long tradition within the Jewish community of silk weavers. The silk weaving connection is specific enough to be significant. It was not a generic trade. In Valencia and across the Crown of Aragon, silk weaving was dominated by Jewish craftsmen, a detail that points away from a Genoese wool weaver's household and toward an Iberian Jewish family maintaining its craft while navigating the suffocating pressures of the Inquisition era. The first serious suggestion of Columbus's Jewish heritage came from Simon Wiesenthal, who in Sails of Hope posited that Columbus may have had an ulterior motive in his famous 1492 voyage. As Spain's Jews faced expulsion under the Alhambra Decree, Wiesenthal hypothesized that Columbus could have sought a new land for his people, a haven from persecution. Wiesenthal wrote that decades before any DNA was tested. What he was working from was a pattern of circumstantial evidence that historians had been accumulating and largely dismissing for years. The DNA results of 2024 did not prove Wiesenthal right on every detail, but they made dismissing him far harder. The voyage that left on the wrong day. One detail about the departure of Columbus's first voyage has been sitting in plain sight for centuries without receiving the weight it deserves. Columbus set sail on August 3, 1492. The expulsion deadline for Spain's Jews was July 31, 1492. The overlap is not coincidental proximity. It is the same calendar, the same ports, and the same political machinery operating simultaneously. Columbus embarked on his first voyage on August 3, 1492, the same year the Alhambra Decree was issued, expelling Jews from Spain. The synchronization of these events has led some scholars to speculate that Columbus's actions may have been influenced by the socio-political turmoil surrounding the Jewish community. The possibility that Columbus sought to navigate a world in flux for Jews adds a layer of intrigue to his motivations and decisions. Rabbi Abraham Cooper of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who often heard Wiesenthal speak about the Alhambra Decree in his talks around the world, said that learning about the DNA evidence made perfect sense. It doesn't mean he wasn't looking for a path to India, Cooper said, but to his mind it means that in all probability, Columbus had family victimized by the Inquisition, and the trade route may have been a pretext. The voyage was likely a reflection of the desperation of someone who wanted to try to find a haven for hidden Jews who were forced to flee. That reframing changes the entire emotional texture of the 1492 voyage. The standard narrative is ambition, a confident mariner pressing west for trade routes and glory. The alternate reading that the DNA evidence now supports is something closer to survival. A man from a persecuted community, wearing the mask his era demanded, sailing away from the same fire that was consuming his people. What the writings were hiding. Columbus left behind an unusually large volume of written material for a man of his era. His journals, his letters to the Spanish crown, his book of prophecies, his marginal annotations and books he had read, all of it has been studied intensely for centuries, and within that material, certain patterns have quietly accumulated. Columbus's writings reveal a man influenced by Jewish theology, and some scholars have even suggested he knew some Ladino. But they also paint a picture of someone who was fundamentally a Christian, who believed his voyages were divinely ordained. It was somewhat messianic. One historian described Columbus's mission, which included occasions where he heard the voice of God. The messianic framing is worth examining. Columbus wrote repeatedly about recovering Jerusalem, about end times prophecy, about his voyages as part of a divine plan stretching toward the apocalypse. This was not unusual Catholic piety. It was a very specific theological strain, one that ran through both Jewish and Christian mysticism of the period, and that a man steeped in Sephardic tradition would have absorbed deeply. Columbus signed his documents in an unusual, cryptic fashion mirroring Jewish customs. His signature was a triangular arrangement of letters that has never been fully decoded. Researchers have noted that the specific letter combinations in that arrangement correspond to Hebrew abbreviations used in Jewish practice, a blessing written in code, hidden inside the official signature of a man presenting himself as a devoted servant of the Catholic crown. None of this is proof of a secret double life in the way a spy thriller would present it. But together, the language patterns, the theological obsessions, the cryptic signature, the timing of the voyage, the silk-weaving family background, and now the genetic markers confirmed by 4 independent laboratories across 2 continents. They form a picture that the Genoese wool weaver story was never designed to contain. The mask held for 532 years. The bones gave it up in October 2024. The DNA test that changed history. In May 2024, a team led by forensic geneticist José Antonio Lorente at the University of Granada published findings that had been 22 years in the making. The results landed in a way that rewrote 500 years of carefully constructed history. DNA extracted from bone fragments housed in Seville Cathedral matched genetic markers consistent with Western Mediterranean Jewish ancestry. Not Italian Catholic, not the Genoese merchant class, Jewish. The markers showed a pattern found in Sephardic populations that had lived across Spain, Portugal, and parts of southern France for over a millennium before 1492. The study used advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis combined with Y chromosome testing, cross-referencing samples from Columbus's confirmed son Hernando and his brother Diego against the remains long believed to be Christopher's. The genetic signature did not match the story that every textbook had been teaching since the 1800s. The trail of forced erasure. The findings align with a historical pattern that has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Between 1391 and 1492, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Jews across the Iberian Peninsula faced a choice that was not really a choice at all: convert to Christianity or leave. Those who converted became known as conversos, or new Christians. Those who refused were expelled in 1492 under the Alhambra Decree, signed by Ferdinand and Isabella on March 31st of that year. The same monarchs who funded Columbus's voyage. The timing was not a coincidence, it was a collision. Historians, including Jane Frances Amler and Charles Garcia, have spent decades tracking the linguistic, behavioral, and documentary evidence pointing toward Columbus's Jewish roots. Garcia's 2012 book, The Secret Jew, laid out over 50 pieces of circumstantial evidence, from Columbus's use of Hebrew phrases in letters to his insistence on avoiding pork in his diet, a pattern noted by crew members and later scholars. The language that gave him away. Columbus's personal writings contain patterns that do not fit a Catholic Italian merchant. In letters to his son Diego, he repeatedly used a small symbol resembling the Hebrew letters Bet He, an abbreviation for Bezrat Hashem, meaning with God's help. This marking appears in the upper left corner of multiple letters, a placement and phrasing common in Sephardic Jewish correspondence, but absent from Christian Italian writing conventions of the era. Linguistics professor Estelle Irizarry of Georgetown University spent years analyzing Columbus's written Spanish and concluded that his linguistic patterns, syntax, and phrasing matched Catalan-speaking regions of Spain, not Genoa. He wrote in Castilian Spanish with what she described as a Catalan substrate, meaning the underlying structure of his sentences followed Catalan grammar rules even when the vocabulary was Spanish. Genoese Italians of the period wrote in Ligurian dialects or formal Italian, not Catalan-inflected Spanish. The protector network that funded the impossible. Columbus's voyage was not funded by pawning Isabella's jewels, despite the romantic myth. The money came from a network of converso financiers who had reasons of their own to see a western route open. Luis de Santangelo, a converso and chancellor of the royal household, personally advanced 1.4 million maravedis to cover expedition costs. Gabriel Sanchez, another converso serving as royal treasurer of Aragon, co-signed financial instruments backing the voyage. Both men came from families that had converted under pressure in prior decades. Both faced Inquisition scrutiny. Both had relatives who had fled or been burned. The financial structure supporting Columbus's ships traces directly through a web of new Christian merchants, bankers, and officials who operated in the narrow space between survival and exposure. Historian Simon Wiesenthal argued in his 1973 book, Sails of Hope, that Columbus may have seen the expedition as more than exploration, as a potential refuge, a way to establish a haven beyond Inquisition reach. The inheritance pattern that broke tradition. Columbus's will, written in 1506 shortly before his death, contains clauses that make no sense within Catholic norms but align perfectly with Jewish practice. He directed that 1/10 of his income go to the poor, without specifying a church or Christian charity, a pattern matching the Jewish obligation of tzedakah. He instructed that money be given to persons in need in a discreet manner, again echoing Jewish charitable traditions that emphasize anonymous giving. He established a trust fund for a dowry for poor girls, but did not limit it to Christians, an unusual omission for a Catholic of that era. Most strikingly, he ordered that his heirs continue these practices in perpetuity, creating a multi-generational obligation that mirrored Jewish mitzvah structures rather than typical Christian estate planning. Canon law experts reviewing the will in modern times have noted its unusual nature. The Seville Cathedral deception. The bones tested in the 2024 study were not the only remains claiming to be Columbus. His body crossed the Atlantic 4 times after death, moved from Valladolid to Seville in 1509, then to Santo Domingo in 1537, to Havana in 1795, and back to Seville in 1898 after the Spanish-American War. The Dominican Republic has long claimed they possess the real remains, holding bones in the Columbus Lighthouse in Santo Domingo that were discovered during church renovations in 1877. Spain insists their Seville bones are authentic. The DNA study confirmed that the Seville remains show male line descent consistent with Columbus's known relatives, but also revealed something Spain had not advertised. Only about 15% of a complete skeleton exists in that tomb. The rest is missing. possibly still in the Caribbean, possibly lost to time, possibly moved by family members who knew that Spanish authorities could not be trusted with a Jewish ancestor's remains during the Inquisition years. What the silence protected. For over 500 years, the Columbus family, the Spanish crown, the Catholic Church, and later governments on both sides of the Atlantic had reasons to maintain the Genoa narrative. Acknowledging Jewish ancestry would have invalidated the religious justification for conquest, undermined the Christianization mission that legally supported Spanish claims in the New World, and complicated centuries of national mythology built on the image of a Catholic explorer spreading the faith. The DNA results do not erase the violence of colonization. They do not soften the devastation Columbus's voyages brought to indigenous populations across the Americas. What they do is strip away the religious cover story that made that violence seem ordained. Columbus was not a man on a mission from God. He was a man running from a kingdom that wanted people like him erased. The difference matters, not because it excuses what followed, but because the lie was told to us who got to write history, and the truth shows us who history tried to bury. For centuries, the story stayed locked behind cathedral walls, hidden in bone fragments no one dared to test, buried under layers of national pride and religious narrative. Christopher Columbus was supposed to be the Italian Catholic hero who brought Christianity to the New World. That version was cleaner, simpler, safer. The DNA didn't care about any of that. It told a different story, one about a man who might have been running just as much as he was exploring, sailing away from a country that was hunting people like him, funded by other people wearing the same mask of conversion, leaving on a date that wasn't a coincidence but a necessity. The name was wrong. The birthplace was wrong. The motivation was rewritten. And for 500 years, everyone with power had a reason to keep it that way. What changed in 2024 wasn't just a genetic test. It was the final collapse of a story that never quite fit, told by people who needed it to. The bones crossed an ocean 4 times after death, moved and hidden and claimed by different countries, but the truth inside them waited. It didn't need permission. It just needed someone to finally look. If this changed how you see history, hit subscribe. We break down the stories they don't want questioned with the receipts they can't deny. Drop a comment if you knew any of this before today. Most people don't. That's not an accident. See you in the next one.